else. I want to start with Marxism and what it is, and how Chris saw it and what I learned from Chris and Cliff, and that very important core leadership. Because Marxism is a living science, and it needs to be able to explain the world when the world changes. And Marxism is also a living art, and it needs to be able to inspire people, ordinary people, to see themselves in a different way as a result of understanding how the world works. And the thing about Chris he was a practitioner of both of those, science and art. That was his great strength. It's terribly important because when I went to the LSE in 1966, the world was a very different place in the sense in which half the world, directly or indirectly, was communist or communist influence. Not just in terms of the Cold War and Russia, China, etc., and the Eastern European bloc and so on, but India, the main opposition was communist. Half of Europe, the main opposition was communist. It was a fantastically powerful bloc. When I arrived at the LSE, and if you saw my article on the Socialist Worker, I begin with the famous LSE canteen table. It was a very naive first year. In the canteen there was this raucous din, and there was a whole number of shouted questions. The one I picked on was, but Chris, China had a genuine communist revolution. That turned out to be a really important question, and his answer, and the range of answers that flowed from that, were incredibly important. This group, that looked like pirates to me, was screaming and shouting at each other. I didn't know at the time. They called themselves the LSE Socialist Society. 3 had joined the International Socialists. The rest had come from a mixture of communist and anarchist backgrounds, but they were relatively sophisticated before they arrived. So they just looked completely mad, to be absolutely frank about it, and it was a very intense, slightly intimidating group of people, but also fantastically fascinating, because what they were saying seemed to be making a lot of sense. Simultaneously, the student movement took off. I'm not going to go into the detail of how it took off. It began at the LSE. It's not terribly important in terms of this conversation. What's very important is the way this kind of hardcore group of effectively Trotskyists turned towards this student movement, which was incredibly naive, but was very large, very militant, and how they related to it. And here Chris, there's 2 or 3 phases. I'll say there's 3 phases for Chris in this period. There's first of all a kind of young intellectual who'd understood the need to refashion Marxism, to understand what the communist bloc was about and why it wasn't communist. That's the first thing. The second thing was then how to relate to all of these students. And no one anticipated a student movement. That's not what the kind of books had said. It was supposed to be a workers' movement, not a student movement. But the great strength, and always strength of our organisation, our tendency, is to be extremely flexible. And the flexibility includes, this is Marxism a living science, being able to respond to new movements when you don't expect them. And the IS group did, and Chris did, and he helped to lead, sometimes reluctantly, that hardcore group towards this evolving, fast-moving student movement. And they did it very, very well, and they led it to begin with. But then something else happened. I'm looking around the room, and 1 or 2 faces who may vaguely remember this period, because the student movement took on a life of its own. It developed its own kind of politics, slightly crazy, kind of hippie anarchist to begin with, and then kind of an over-the-top identification with the Viet Cong and the, I don't know why it's funny, because it's not really funny. This was a really tough, revolutionary peasant movement that was taking on the Americans. These are amazingly courageous peasant guerrillas, and somehow students got the idea that we were the urban counterpart. Now, I know it sounds completely mad, but a lot of students, I must admit I partly did as well, talked ourselves into believing, maybe it was too many drinks in the bar and other substances, I don't know. But anyway, we did talk ourselves into believing that that's what we were. It was completely ridiculous. And again, so there's now a new fight to be had with this kind of trend. And Chris, and the Socialist Society was growing very fast, but this trend was also growing. So the trick there, the skill was to undercut this unexpected political tendency. And that required firm argument and also a lot of tactical manoeuvring. In other words, not just a question of argument, but how do you give a lead? And the key, and one of the things that began to happen was a kind of the idea of provocation, that a kind of an elite group should become really militant, provoke the authorities, wreck lectures, be prepared to do all sorts of really crazy things to try to provoke the authorities. And in other words, the IS group was kind of overtaken on the left, something completely unexpected. And again, Chris played an absolutely central role in positioning a rapidly growing cadre to give a lead to the student movement. And the IS group, as a result of what was a very effective, very sophisticated